So welcome everybody as we continue the Athens Democracy Forum. One of the phenomena that has been prevalent over the last few months has been the sight of street protests that were essentially leaderless or around a very loose group organization, and whether they can really bring their brand of politics into the more established structures of politics. So I'm lucky and feel very fortunate to be able to discuss this with four people this afternoon. The first of them is Nathan Law. He is well known in Hong Kong as an activist. I'm sure he will tell us what is the latest from Hong Kong in terms of how realistic is it that any political activist from outside the establishment can make a mark with the new security laws and other measures in place. We also have with us, I'm told, Farida Nabourema, who is an activist from Togo. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to see her protests and those of her fellow Togolese on the internet, but it's very moving and very passionate and very expressive. And then there's Oleksandra Ustinova, who I believe joins us from Ukraine. We know how much Ukraine has had attention in recent months and years, perhaps a little bit less than recently. So I look forward to hearing the latest from there. And then joining me here in Athens is Khalil Osiris, I hope I pronounced that vaguely correctly, who has been making a big impact here with our guests and is prepared to talk about lots of things, most topically being Black in the United States of America. So if I could invite you, Nathan, to kick us off with a picture of what's going on in Hong Kong and whether you think street protests can morph into more established politics.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's my honor to be able to participate the Athens Democracy Forum in consecutive years. This is my second year. So I'm glad that people now are still really paying attention on Hong Kong. And compared to my speech last year, is obviously the prolonged movement in Hong Kong has been last for more than a year. And for now, we haven't been able to see that kind of sea of people seen or massive protests like we had last year because of the emergence of the national security law, which was implemented 3 months ago. Under the law, if you chant certain slogan or display certain signal that the government consider it as inappropriate, you may face years of imprisonment. It is a draconian measure implemented directly from the Chinese government on Hong Kong without any local consultation and legislation process, and making people fear and quash their basic rights in order to silence them. So this is the latest situation. And after a year-long protest, there are more than 10,000 people arrested. Several hundreds of them are facing years of imprisonment. And seemingly for now, if we're talking about social movement as a pendulum, last year it was at its peak, a lot of street actions, a lot of conflicts. And for now, it slides down to its relatively quiet point that people are laying low and trying to think of new ways to protest. So for now, it's rarely that we could see there are massive protests on the scene, even though there are still people trying to protest. But under the COVID situation and also the draconian national security law, people are more worried about having public gathering. So for now, the power of street movement indeed not as obvious as the one last year. So we have been seeing fewer and fewer news about Hong Kong's protest. But for now, there are still people struggling, and we are trying to find ways to gain the international attention and also climbing up pressure towards the Chinese government. And what's more important is, compared to 1 year ago, the consensus in the international stage to be more critical and assertive towards the Chinese authoritarian expansion power has become more and more prominent, and we've generated more and more pressure to put to the Chinese government to tackle its gross human rights violation in its country more than a year ago. So for now, even though we have less street protest, but in terms of China's external pressure, international pressure, we have been managed to increase it and making a consensus across political aisles. So for me, our protest and the fight for Hong Kong's democracy has to rely on also local protest and the international pressure. And we're trying to combine these two tactics and make it work. So for me, in short-term future, it is very difficult to really comprehensively change China's heavy-handed tactics towards Hong Kong. But in the long-term future, I have hope and I have faith on Hong Kong's democracy.
Okay, so for the moment, a more traditional approach, hoping that your friends outside of China can bring pressure to bear on Beijing. What I'd like to do now is to have Farida Nabourema join us. I would also like to remind everybody who's watching and listening that we do take questions and you should feed in what you have. In fact, there is one already for you, Farida, that whether you can justify the safety of your friends and family for the greater prosperity of your country and its future. But if you'd like to tell us how your activity has looked so far, we're anxious to hear.
Thank you very much, Alison. I will have you repeat the question because I missed the first part of it. But before we get there, in terms of Togo, we held masses in Togo from 2017 all the way to 2019. And to provide more background on Togo, for those of you who have never heard much about Togo has been ruled by the oldest military regime in Africa. They seized power in 1967 and he ruled the country for 38 years. When he died in 2005, California Singh took over in a military coup, and he has been president since 2005, making him the only president in West Africa serving the current fourth term. For the past 53 years, the people of Togo have been organizing at different levels to demand change and democracy. And some of those campaigns have yielded to certain results. But in the last 3 years, the most consistent and most campaign was the one demanding the departure of Fonia Singh. I'm an activist a little over a decade ago, and I launched in 2011 along with other comrades in the resistance, the former schools, and our main goal is to end dictatorship in Togo. Some of the critical tools that we use to mobilize our community, it gave us the flexibility to communicate people, even in communities. Unfortunately, the government has managed to kind of like cut that part by investing massively in surveillance, and they managed to infiltrate a lot of platforms on which activists and communities, and they proceeded arresting hundreds of activists and many are currently living in exile and out for their lives. In Togo, we have not seen realization of democracy we have before. Despite all these years of success, the masses that took in that got hundreds of thousands of Togolese citizens on the streets, the big participation and involvement of both women and the younger populations, we still have not gotten the result that we want. As actually, the regime has managed to consolidate power and has also managed to block every single test that we have to protest. So last year, the government of
fear that we have lost you. The connection was rather weak. I'm so sorry, but we will try to re-establish the connection. And I wonder if instead I could turn to Oleksandra Ustinova to tell us about this current situation in Ukraine. Over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting and for letting me represent my country. So I'll try to be short and taking into account the main topic of this forum, I'd like to say that Ukraine probably was one of the pioneers, one of the leaders of the protest in the region. And after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, Armenia and even the Belarus followed us. And when I'm looking at the protests in Belarus at the moment, I'm very inspired, and I really hope that people there, no matter what COVID does or what Lukashenko does, will win. Because they're standing for the same freedom and for the same future that Ukraine did 6 years ago. And I believe that they will manage to go through and without as many lives lost as Ukraine did. Looking at what is going on in Ukraine at the moment, I can say that we are going through very turbulent times. First of all, it is much easier for me to speak right now because we are more of a democracy right now than my colleagues talking today at the panel are. I'm very supportive for the Hong Kong movement. And I remember a year ago, I was in Stanford, and I met the guys who were one of the leaders of the movement as well. And I was so much inspired by them. And frankly speaking, I was trying to share all the knowledge I had, because I was one of the leaders of the movement back there in Ukraine in 2014, and I was trying to share as much of my experience of how we managed to do the messaging, of how we managed to bring people out on the streets in a very cold weather. And I'm really hoping that you guys will win. If we talk about what is going on in Ukraine, it is really difficult right now to talk about any street movements or any kind of protests because of the COVID. Ukraine right now is going to the red zone, and unfortunately, the government is taking an advantage of it. We can see that different rules are applied, and at some point, people can go out on the streets for fun events if they are considered, if they're actually supported by the local government or by the national government. But on the other side, if you start talking about the protests, if you're against the government or you don't like one of the new laws being adopted by the parliament, people are not allowed to go on the streets. But again, it is not the same as it is as how my colleagues are talking at the moment, because we managed back 6 years ago to break the chain when we were shot in the streets, when we lost hundreds of lives in the streets, and we managed to end up in a war with Russia that occupied Ukraine, unfortunately. COVID did change a lot, but on the other side, more young people are being involved, because the online media and the social media are taking an advantage right now, and people are sharing their sharing news, sharing ideas, and even making fun of politicians right now through social media more than they would do before that on the streets. More young people are being involved, even, I would say, even not adult, but really like young people. And this is one of the advantages of the situation right now. On the other side, I understand this is not enough. If the government needs to understand that people can go out on the streets and push hard as it was before in 2014.
Okay, thank you so much for that fill-in. That answers a lot of questions. I'd like now to turn to Khalil and to have you explain, amongst other things. We have seen not so rare, but not so often forceful protests from a cross-section of society in the United States in recent months. Can you explain a little bit what you think that means? Was it a surprise for you that Black Lives Matter and other protest movements have taken off?
No, it's not. It wasn't a surprise to me to see the reaction to the murder of George Floyd being global. I think the movement today has to be thought about in the context of historical movements, not just in the United States, but around the world as it relates to citizens' response to injustice, to inequality. And fundamentally, that's what we're talking about in the United States, where the response was one in which we saw clear evidence of the kinds of injustices that we have historically experienced as Black people in America. And that had resonance with people of color, particularly all over the world. In fact, the marches and protests and activism that has been inspired by the murder of George Floyd is the largest, has been documented as the largest mass movement in the history of the world. They're saying 20 to 30 million people around the world have responded. And if you look at, going to your original question, how have protests in the past translated to mainstream politics? An example of that in the civil rights movement is that many of the political activists found themselves in a place, in a position where, in order to continue the struggle, we had to move from the streets into political structures. We found that it was necessary to organize communities along the lines of their own political interest. So the aim of the civil rights movement was indeed to have a political impact and change policy. That hasn't changed in terms of the need of our movement. What has changed is that America is expected to be minority white by the year 2045, it's argued. What I would say is America, if you look at our youth population, is already minority white. And so that dynamic has caused many more people to join the movement.
And does it in a way diminish the role of identifying as white or Black?
Yeah, I think that ultimately what we hear is that people who enter the movement from a particular issue or a particular point of reference, i.e. Black people in America arguing that we are not going to accept the injustices of structural racism anymore, we have a particular complaint to raise. We have a particular issue to address. Our particular historical issue will never go away by simply talking about general solutions to the injustices. And so I think that we're now at a stage where we can see a both and, or a multi-issue approach to dealing with systemic injustice.
Thank you. If I can swerve back from that, do a corona swerve here, as it's known in New York when you walk the dog and get out of the way of other people. I have a question also that moves this discussion in that right direction. Nathan, this is actually for you. What is your strategy for the coming times, asks Subhash Pacha, and will democracy ever be established in Hong Kong? I'd like to also, if it's relevant, you can reflect on whether the experience of Black Lives Matter in the US in recent months has any bearing on the situation in Hong Kong.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And for Hong Kong people, we've been fighting for democracy for over 30 years. And that is the promise made by Beijing in the 80s. And when Hong Kong was handed back from the British government to the Chinese government in 1997. So we've got a strong legitimate grounds to ask for autonomy and democracy. And for us, I think, at least for me, the Hong Kong issue has played in central parts of the discussion regarding to China policy for the past year, due to the very obvious and massive movement happened around for the past year. And also we are more and more aware of the aggressiveness and expansionist nature of China. So I think for now, at the end of the day, what we have to address is not only about Hong Kong, but it's also about China, and it's also about the threats of authoritarianism posed by these regimes to the world, to the democracies. So I think in terms of strategies, we've got some different layers in that. On the one hand, we have to address the gross human rights violation in China, including the concentration camp in Xinjiang and the deprive of basic rights of Hong Kong people. But also we have to be aware that these kind of actions is not only serving the needs of the Chinese people or Hong Kong people, but also to the world, because for the past years, we've been seeing the infiltration from these authoritarian countries towards the democracies and trying to discredit and dismantle the democratic values and systems from inside out. So the help and the cause of Hong Kong people is also in a line to all the people around the world, especially living in democracies, who shared the same values. So I think this is a great angle and an appeal to garner more support. And in regards to the other movement that is also fighting for equality and justice, it echoes to each other. And I think it is important that we build a trend to surround it by the narrative of shared values and basic human rights, rather than traits realpolitik and these narratives that could undermine the pursuit that we all have.
So you're saying that you would prefer to stick to the spontaneous methods rather than try to have something more organized? Question.
Well, I think it really, depends on a specific context. And in Hong Kong, even though we have organized protest, but we also have to be cooperated by improvised and spontaneous ones, because that is the best way to really get rid of the surveillance and the heavy-handed suppression from the police, and to make an impact to Hong Kong and to the world.
Yes. We're trying really hard to get Farida back, but while she remains somewhere out in the remote satellite, whatever, Alexandra, can I turn to you again? You mentioned the example of Belarus. Were you equally surprised by the Far East protests in Far Eastern Russia, I mean in Khabarovsk, which I thought was an example also of a classic eruption of discontent with no specific leader?
Frankly speaking, I was not surprised, and I think in 10 or 15 years we'll definitely see this region being totally different. It's not going to be the same as we see it now, and I think that Belarus and Khabarovsk, and trust me, it's going to be more and more in especially Siberia and in the northern part of Russia. There would be more protests and more movements against Moscow and Kremlin, because people see the injustice. People see that Kremlin and the corrupt politicians are getting advantage of their own lives, and people live really poor there. If you look at the Khabarovsk, if you look at the other regions besides Moscow, Russia is a really poor country, and with everything becoming globalized and digitalized, people can see this difference, people can feel this difference, and people will not stay quiet anymore. Belarus was predicted, it was expected, and frankly speaking, I had some of my friends flew to Ukraine a few months before the movement, actually before I would say their revolution had started, and before people started going out in the streets, because they were because the majority of their friends were already arrested, and they were one of the top journalists in the country. And they said that these elections would be the turning point for Belarus, because people are fed up. And actually, COVID was one of the latest, probably, dots, I would say, in Lukashenko. So people realized that Lukashenko was terribly lying, saying there is no COVID, that nobody's been infected, and people kept losing their families, kept losing their friends. And once you turn this injustice from just, I don't know, losing money because of corruption to actually losing lives of your relatives, and the government is not doing anything about it, it was it was predicted, and people were saying that everybody knew that Lukashenko would try to take an advantage of these elections, that it will be totally faked. But everybody who knew this region and who knew Belarusians and the movement inside said that basically, if you compare to what happened in Ukraine in 2014, we had our revolution started in Facebook. They had their revolution started in Telegram channels. And people, when you see up to 400,000 people being gathered in different Telegram channels discussing Lukashenko regime and elections, it's obvious for everybody you cannot keep up with this. And I think Khabarovsk and the other parts of Russia will be only the beginning, and they will face the same, and Putin will face the same issues as Lukashenko is facing at the moment.
Thank you. Khalil, would you say that there's any chance that the effect of those protests carries over in any direct way to the United States? I'm alluding to the fact that Americans traditionally have been not so interested in events outside their own borders, and there's certainly plenty to think about in the United States.
Yes.
But at the same time, does this contribute, what Oleksandra is describing, to a general atmosphere of foment and discontent over inequality?
I think it absolutely does. We're in a period where our global concerns are being surfaced. We're able now to see other people around the world in ways that we never have. We're able to be in communication, in relationship with struggles around the world in real time. One of the caveats I'd like to raise in this conversation is that it is not necessarily the intent of protest movements to enter directly into mainstream politics. It is also critical to understand that the resources of the ruling party and the establishment are absolutely vast in its response, in its reaction to protest. And one of the things that I think we underestimated in America, particularly in the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, was the veracity, the absolute ruthlessness that our own government was prepared to act against us, to execute against us. And so as a party, the Black Panther Party itself made the effort to go from a vanguard movement to a mass-based movement and was fundamentally unsuccessful in doing it. Yeah. But we were in regular communication with movements in Africa. We supported the anti-apartheid movement. We sent soldiers to Angola to engage in frontline war. So our organization ultimately became part of a global movement for human rights and justice.
Maybe we should just explain for people who are not as old as we are that what exactly the Black Panther Party stood for.
Yes, so the full title is Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. The organization was established for the purpose of challenging the injustices, the police brutalities in our communities across America.
Established in the 1960s.
In the 1960s, 1968, with Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. And that movement was on the heels of the civil rights movement and very much inspired by the teaching of Malcolm X. And ultimately Marxist-Leninist ideology.
Although that really has played very little role in American political life.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's interesting. So can I turn it back to you, Oleksandra and Nathan, to explain to us, if you feel it's relevant, what exactly can be achieved by a more international approach? And is that, in fact, what will bring new values and new practices? Or are we just all going to be utterly bewildered and slightly terrified by COVID and not be able to think further politically?
Nathan, you want to start? Or should I? Nathan, you want to start?
Maybe you should.
Okay, sorry. I thought he was. I saw him speaking, but I couldn't hear it. I'm sorry. So, frankly speaking, I think it is really impossible without the international collaboration, international cooperation. Because frankly speaking, I remember during even the worst times at Maidan in Ukraine, when you thought there was no future because you were terrified, we were shot to death. When you saw people in other countries stood up for you and organized protests for you, frankly speaking, I was at the protest at the Chinese embassy a few months ago that my friends organized in support of Hong Kong. I had to wear a cap because I'm an MP, so I cannot be there. But still, it is very important to show people, first of all, support, because once you see you're not alone in front of your regime, in front of your government, it is, I don't know, at least for us back then when we were fighting for our freedom, it probably, I don't know, it gives you wings so you can fly, because you can see support from people outside of your country as well. So you believe that you are doing the right thing. You're fighting not for your own rights, not for your own country, but also for, I would say, the freedom for everybody. Because right now, as I look back 6 years ago, I could never even realize that Ukraine could be an example for other countries like Belarus, like Armenia, to go against their regimes and fight for their own freedom. On the other side, it is really important for activists all over the world to unite their, especially democratic governments, in fight against the regimes of the governments who are corrupt and who are undemocratic. Because I remember sanctions and the fear of sanctions from the EU, from the US, were one of the key instruments for us to push our leaders, our former leaders, to do certain things. And it still does work. And that's why even if you live in a democratic country and you can still help people in other countries just standing up, just writing letters to you, I don't know, senators, to your government, and helping people in fighting for their freedom with your own tools that you already have.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it very quickly to Nathan because he's had the least time to speak. And I would conclude by just observing that, once again, the key seems to be togetherness as human beings and across borders. Yes. But Nathan, you have the last word here.
Well, thank you so much. I think for the past decades, the Western world and the democracy has been having a misjudgment towards China, thinking that with its economic growth, they will open up and democratize. And the history proves that, wishful thinking wrong. And for us, for now, we should be very aware of these expansionist authoritarianism, especially in a digital age. They have much more methods to infiltrate into the other democracies than the ones in the last century. And we have to be very, very aware of the dangers that they pose to our democratic system and to our shared values. So for me, it's important that I, as a reminder, to remind the world that actually we have a collaborative and collective responsibility to tackle these authoritarianism, and we should work together. That kind of togetherness, yes, indeed, is very important. And it's not only about helping who are under the authoritarian ruling, but it's helping to build up a stronger and more legitimate democratic values and community.
And are there particular actions that people should try to undertake from outside? I mean, without wanting to.
Yeah, of course. Before taking like concrete actions, we need to have that rhetoric and narrative change. China is a threat, really posing to our democratic community rather than a strategic partnership or in a golden era, as we said in the UK. And secondly, concrete policies of high scrutiny on state-owned enterprises, sanctions on individuals and companies, and also implementing measures to really safeguard the values that we enjoy. These are very important ones. We need strategic planning towards China, but we also have to protect our democracy by holding them accountable overseas.
Thank you. I lied. It's not the last word. I'm going to give that to Khalil, who has contributed so much that has been happening in different fora in Athens here. So maybe you can sum up for us something that we were discussing last night, which is that suffering is a choice.
Yes.
And whether or not we should cast the struggle here in terms of personal suffering or indeed collective suffering, or is it something more individually important, one person's action to overcome what they see as inequality?
I think that both are equally important. It's critical for individuals to feel a sense of purpose, a sense of worth, and a sense of efficacy about their own potential. Simultaneously, we must look at what collective action means as we share responsibility for making change. One of the challenges that we faced in our movement in the US, when the reaction to our struggle for justice was violently opposed by our own government, one of the things that was used, one of the tactics used, was to divide us from each other, to interrupt our communications, to cause us to be distrustful of each other. And many people along the way did, in fact, do things that would be seen as betraying the principles of our movement. So I would like to close with a proverb I shared with you, a Turkish proverb I shared with you yesterday evening. It says that when the axe came into the forest, the trees said, "The handle is one of us." The implications of that statement is not just others who we think betray our movement or challenge our movement, but for us to begin to see how we ourselves are complicitous in the kind of injustices that we are fighting most passionately to overturn. And many movements, in the absence of this internal critique, are not going to be able to have the kind of impact that we seek. So this is what I hope.
That is a fine closing thought. Thank you so much, everybody listening. Farida, greetings, and hopefully next time we'll make a connection with you. Sorry, I did it too quickly.